we are ready to kick off our very first talk, and it's going to be a Capstone Ethereum panel. And we have Dan Shaw, Paul Brody, Karen Scarbrough, and Joe McCann, who are going to be talking about the industry impact in the enterprise world. So they're all here. And with that, I'd like to welcome all of you to turn your cameras on, and we'll kick off with our first talk for the Impact Summit. Welcome.
Hi, Kartik. Thank you very much. I'm Paul Brody. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. I think we're waiting
Fantastic.
on
So
Karen.
I'm Paul Brody. I'm the global blockchain leader at EY. I'm actually going to give for the Capstone Summit, I think I'm going to start by giving a short talk, and then we're going to go into the panel discussion.
Sounds perfect.
So anyway, yeah, so I'm Paul Brody. I'm the global blockchain leader at EY, and I'm really delighted to be here. I have been a huge Ethereum fan for many, many years. In fact, quite a few years ago, I was the very first person to build a blockchain at IBM, and we built it on the alpha version of Ethereum. And so I have been since I think 2014 or so working in and around the Ethereum space. It's been incredibly exciting, but all of that time I have been in that capacity as a representative and a participant in a large enterprise environment. And as you can see, I've worn my best soul-crushing large enterprise blue suit today. First, I was at IBM, and then shortly after that, I went over to EY Ernst & Young, which is one of the world's big audit firms and professional services firms. But I have never lost my passion for Ethereum. I've never lost my passion for blockchain. In fact, the paper I wrote at IBM was called Device Democracy, because I wanted to bring the decentralized vision, the democratized vision of technology from blockchain into the world of IoT as well. And I have never kind of lost that desire to kind of properly decentralize and industrialize this technology. What I want to talk to all of you today about is why this incredibly vibrant, incredibly capable Ethereum community should invest some time and energy in not just tolerating the participation of large enterprises, but really welcoming them. And I know it's an incredibly vibrant community. I've been watching the finalists in this hackathon all afternoon, and it's been incredible. But enterprises have a lot to contribute as well. And I will argue, and I would like to argue, that it's not just that enterprises have a lot to contribute, it's that in working with enterprises, we will help to make together Ethereum to be the world's most dominant public blockchain, and that is in and of itself a genuine public good. So let me get into the thing. I mean, I'm a corporate person. We would not be corporate people if we did not have slides to share with you. And so let me share with you some slides, because that's what we do. So let me talk about embracing Ethereum and the enterprise in order to make Ethereum and the enterprises more successful together. The internet has created a winner-take-all economy. Now, I feel like I've been around forever in the world of internet, but this is the kind of the world that we live in. The internet has rewarded scale and network effect, and the result has been a really substantial centralization of the digital world, right? Centralized intermediaries have used the economics of software, which is that another copy costs nothing. They've used the power of network effects, right? The more participants in your network, the more valuable your network becomes. And they've used those two together along with proprietary technology to create vendor lock-in and market dominance. This isn't just a theory, and it's not just something that's happening in search or a couple of other industries. Almost across the board in heavy-duty research that's been done by economists, what we found is over the last 30 years, the global economy has become more centralized, right? It has become more dominated by a smaller number of companies. Those companies are immensely profitable, and they're also immensely powerful. And what I would argue is that it does not have to be that way. Software and technology does not have to lead to monopoly or oligopoly. Quite the contrary. I believe blockchains offer us a different path. We still have the economics of software, zero marginal cost. We still have network effects. But on public blockchains, instead of vendor lock-in from proprietary technology, we have genuine open access, and that should lead to a substantially more level playing field and real competition, right? And that's good for all companies in a global digital ecosystem, not just a few really big ones, right? Digital intermediaries are the kind that we've been dealing with for 30 years, right? They have really come to dominate so many different industries. And if you look at these digital intermediaries, they are centrally controlled marketplaces that manage the flow of information. And that flow is often asymmetrical, right? The party at the center knows more about what's going on than any other participant. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about sneakers or car rental or apartment rental. It's not an accident that the central participant in this flow of information often becomes more valuable than all of the participants at the edge, sometimes combined. In a blockchain environment, we can do all the things that centralized digital environments can do, but put everybody on a level playing field, right? And this means same work as centralized systems, but with a truly level playing field and no risk of a central market orchestrator becoming a central market monopolist. Now, fear of digital intermediaries isn't just a theory, it has had a huge impact on how enterprises run their businesses. And what I mean by this is if you look inside the average large company, what you'll see over the last 30 years is ever increasing sophistication inside the enterprise. So they've got digital shop floors, they've got ERP systems that keep track of every order that's been placed and every contract that's been signed and every person that's been hired. There are now planning and scheduling systems that take orders and they do algorithms to determine optimal manufacturing. There are analytical tools, there are machine learning tools. There's a ton of stuff that goes on inside the enterprise. But the fear of being stuck in some kind of all-powerful digital marketplace means that enterprises haven't extended that to integrate with these central market environments. Instead, they stick to very low risk systems. And what that means is that when two companies want to communicate, they may have all this incredible sophistication internally. And when they go to communicate with somebody else or do a deal with somebody else, it all gets reduced to sending somebody a PDF file by email or maybe a spreadsheet, right? If we're lucky, they use something called EDI, electronic data interchange, which is basically business to business text messaging that has not changed since the early 1970s, right? So it takes all this incredible sophistication, shared process, shared facts, shared tools, and boils it down to a little PDF sheet, right? But that's not what enterprises really need. They need sophisticated, smart digital interactions that have multiple parties involved, they have shared facts, and they have shared business logic. Now, some of you who have been participants in this finalist discussion just now, you are thinking to yourself, well, yeah, we know how to do that. That's easy. You're right. It absolutely is, right? We believe at EY that public blockchains will do for business ecosystems what ERP, enterprise resource planning, the software that companies use to manage themselves internally did with inside the enterprise. That those systems joined up the left hand and the right hand. They made sure that if you bought the last widget off the shelf in the store in Omaha, it triggered an order to replace it in California, right? ERP connected the enterprise. Blockchains will do that for connecting between enterprises. Now, the business benefits that we have seen for our clients are gargantuan. And I just want to pick off one, which is one of my favorite examples. EY is building, in cooperation with Microsoft, a blockchain system on Ethereum. In this case, it's a private Ethereum version, although we'd like to get to public one day. We are building on Ethereum the next generation royalty engine from Microsoft. So when Microsoft buys software, they need to pay for it. They need to sell it. They sell it on the Xbox video game system. They need to pay for it. And it's a complicated system, 3,000 different suppliers, everyone with a unique contract. As we move those contracts from paper, from PDF files to blockchain-based, Ethereum-based smart contracts, we're getting enormous performance increases, 99% less cycle time, right? That's a fancy way of saying way faster. Literally 45 days, takes 45 days after the end of the month to calculate, and now we're down to like 4 minutes, right? Not only is it way faster, but it is also substantially cheaper, almost half the price of the existing system. And that includes all the costs to translate the paper contracts into digital contracts. And much more trustworthy because the participants can see business transactions as they're happening. They can inspect the logic. Oh, that's that deal. Here's how much I get. I understand this. This looks like the agreement we negotiated, right? So that's just speeding up the process, and we haven't even gotten to anything all that really sophisticated, right? Where we can get really sophisticated is the kind of stuff that consumers are doing today with DeFi, right? So for consumers, DeFi kind of feels old hat. The first generation of smart contracts weren't actually that smart, and I hope I'm not going to offend anybody here. But the truth is, they kind of kept track of assets. They kept track of the registry of who had those assets and some of the properties of those assets. But when we get into DeFi, we're starting to get into properly smart contracts where you can hold assets, you can move them around, you can insure them, you can pay for them, you can transfer them, you can lease them, you can do all kinds of stuff. This is classic stuff that enterprises need to do. Now, DeFi today isn't suitable for enterprises. It's too early stage. There's too much, there are too many bugs in it, right? Programmability, which is the value proposition, also brings a risk, but also more importantly, there's no privacy in DeFi. But this is what enterprises want. This is what enterprises do today. They do all these things today. They just do them in a very slow, paper-based, expensive process. I shouldn't say paper anymore, it's just PDF files, but it's the same thing. The future of business operations is more than just DeFi though, right? DeFi is clever because it takes financial assets, which are already entirely digital, and kind of acts upon them. But we can do more than that. So if you think about a kind of a classic business model of manufacturing, right? I buy raw materials, I manufacture into product, I move the product out to warehouses, I store them in warehouses, and I sell them in stores. DeFi can deliver decentralized financial services all across that process. We don't need to stop with DeFi. We should go on to DeSys, decentralized systems, right? It's not just that we want to manage finance, we need to manage business operations. No company runs entirely by itself. If you have a fancy new phone that you might have received in the mail this week, that new phone was not made by the company whose name is on the phone. They designed it, they arranged everything, but it was done by other companies, right? And the systems that manage that are very complex. And finally, not just the systems, but the operations themselves, 3D printing, warehousing, air freight, they can all be tokenized and sold and managed on a blockchain in a way that is completely standardized. And it's not an accident that I'm using Lego blocks to depict this, because ultimately, if you pick up the right set of Lego blocks, you can put together a whole company from different decentralized architectures and run an entire business with a very small number of people and an extraordinary degree of automation and integration. All of this is great vision of the future, but there's one thing that is missing, and if Ethereum, the Ethereum community and enterprises are going to meet together, there is one thing that we must embrace together, and it is privacy, right? We want the maximum level of privacy possible. Maybe not always for the same reasons that some Ethereum users do, but enterprises do not want their competition to know what they're buying, how much they're spending, where it's going. They don't want them to know any of that. And privacy should not be confused with anonymity. It's not about evading regulations. It's not about defying the law. It's about keeping your competition from knowing what you're doing, right? And that means private asset management, buy, sell, transfer, pay in privacy. Private business logic. Nobody should be able to read the terms and conditions of the contracts that we have together, right? I strongly believe in the value proposition of proving what we say is truthful, but that does not mean that everybody should be able to see what we agree upon. Verifiable business identity, right? So much of what's been talked about in the recent past with regard to identity is incredibly important, but it's mostly focused on individuals. I also need to know not just that you are you, but also that enterprises I transact with are who they say they are. And then finally, private data synchronization, right? So rules like GDPR and other things mean that we should never leave sensitive personal information or sensitive business information on chain. But we do need to be able to use the chain to transfer data, to identify partners, to prove what we did, that we did what we said we did, right? So these are all things that enterprises and individuals need. And we want to see those things get embraced and built about. And if there's one thing that's frustrating and challenging, it's building for privacy. There's no question it is much harder than building systems without privacy. And I can tell you this because that's all we do. I have probably most of my developers are struggling with the challenges of architecting and building solutions that support privacy on public blockchains, but it's essential. Now at EY, we're investing very, very heavily in public Ethereum. It is the #1 investment priority for us. We've been investing in some really important technologies. Probably the most prominent one that we've been working on is a solution called Nightfall. That's been around for now 3 years. We actually launched the first version, the prototype version of Nightfall in Prague at DevCon a few years ago. And it's a zero-knowledge proof-based tool for enabling private, secure, regulatory compliant transactions on the public Ethereum mainnet. But don't call it EY Nightfall. It's Nightfall because we put it into the public domain, right? It is free. It's in the public domain. We gave up all ownership of it to it. We have donated it to the Ethereum community, although we continue to work on developing and expanding it. We did that again with Baseline. So Baseline, we worked with Microsoft and we worked with Consensus, and we've added a bunch of protocols for completing, from going from private transfers and payments to private transfers and payments and shared business logic. And again, donated into the public domain, this one being managed by the Oasis Foundation. Now, these are huge investments by EY, millions of dollars in research that we are donating in the public domain. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. We're not a nonprofit. We still have a business to run, and we have been building out our own products in this environment. The two ones that you probably have heard about are OpsChain, which is for doing business transactions on blockchains like procurement, traceability, contracts, and then Blockchain Analyzer, which is blockchain analytics, financial statement audit, security testing, and review. And those actually you can try out at blockchain.ey.com. Now, an Ethereum ecosystem that has a lot of enterprise participation, I believe it's not just a bigger ecosystem, it will be a better ecosystem for all the participants. And I feel very, very strongly about this, right? I am here to persuade you, I hope, that enterprises are going to be helpful in building out this ecosystem. To start with, it's going to be a more secure ecosystem. Enterprises have trillions of dollars at stake. So the entire value chain is worth money. It gets a huge amount of focus on security. There are tons of enterprise researchers who want to work on blockchain security. It will be more decentralized, right? Ethereum is already highly decentralized, but what happens when the world's top 2,000 companies decide that they all want to set up their own Ethereum node, that they want to do some staking because they can transact on the Ethereum environment? That means a lot more genuine decentralization by companies who care about a just, verifiable, and properly decentralized system. More scalable. Again, huge amounts of research and energy being invested to maintain reasonable transaction processing times, investment in kind of algorithms and scalability. It's a big deal, right? And it costs a lot of money. And then finally, more private, right? Keeping data secure, keeping it private is a major enterprise priority. And thanks to laws like GDPR, right, it's not just an enterprise priority. The risk of violating those rules, of losing track of your data, it comes with significant financial penalties. So enterprises are prepared to spend real money on research and technology and tools that secure the privacy of your data and do it in a genuinely decentralized blockchain environment. Now, I think in particular, one of the things I want to talk about, and one of the things that I think is underappreciated, is that there's an important role for trusted third parties in making blockchains better ecosystems. We talk a lot about kind of trust-free environments, but the truth is, yes, some parts of the blockchain environment are genuinely kind of no trust needed because everything that happens on chain is verifiable on chain. But that's not always true for the things that happen off chain. And the future of Ethereum is about interacting with and connecting to systems that have instantiations, assets, tools that are off chain. Now, a big part of that can be served with things like oracles. And oracles are brilliant and valuable because they provide redundancy and they provide a kind of form of crowdsourcing of certain data. But there are also some areas where there is only one data provider, and there can only be one data provider. If you want to know whether a particular shipping company delivered your product, the only person who can tell you if that shipping company delivered that product is that shipping company. So how do you know if they're telling the truth? How do you know if they're being accurate? How do you know if their systems are reliable, if their timestamps are correct? The answer is something that has been going on in the audit business for decades. It's called attestation, or SOC reports, which are called System of Control reports. This is a routine business for audit firms, and it should be a part of the future of blockchain, right? Independent attestation doesn't mean, by the way, an end to fraud. It doesn't mean an end to dishonesty. But if you have third parties who are inspecting business process, who are required to put their name on the line, the odds of this of kind of widespread fraud, I think, potentially go down. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. This kind of technology, these capabilities exist in the market today together already. And very importantly, it's really important to remember that there's a difference between a trusted third party, of which you have a choice of many different service providers, and a centralized intermediary that has a veto or control over the system, right? One of these is a useful addition to the environment, I believe. The other is something that I don't want to sign up for, right? I don't want to be the only party that does this, but I want to have a framework and a set of tools that we accept, that in some cases it's useful to have external attestation about something. Now, some of you, your eyes are glazing over. You're like, SOC reports, oh, what are these things? And honestly, I have to tell you, I've been at EY for 5 years. I tried so hard to ignore as much of this as possible for as long as possible. But the reality is that the ins and outs of regulatory compliance, audits, SOC reports are important. And I encourage you to think about these things, not because they're interesting in and of themselves to everybody, but because the stakes are really high, right? The stakes are very high. If a public blockchain, if Ethereum or some other equally good, genuinely decentralized, truly open system doesn't triumph, the result for the world will be bad. And the reason I say that is because we haven't repealed the economics of software, right? Blockchains are still subject to economics of software. That means zero marginal cost and network effects, right? And so what we see over and over again in this world is that time and again, whether it's mainframe operating systems, desktop operating systems, mobile device operating systems, social networks, internet protocols, maybe blockchains as well, we tend to end up with just one and occasionally two dominant platforms, right? Not only do we tend to end up with only one or two dominant technology platforms, but dislodging them is almost impossible, right? Once you've picked a particular platform, right, whatever it is, right, there's very little chance to go back and change your mind, right? There are people who've been trying to get us to use Linux on the desktop for decades. And as much as I love Linux and I love playing around with these technologies, the truth is it's never really gotten any traction, right? And so what I would ask you to do is, if you think about, does it matter if enterprises join the Ethereum blockchain? I would say it does, because if they don't join the Ethereum blockchain, they will join a blockchain. And if that blockchain is not open and genuinely decentralized, it will become a very different environment. So to quote a famous movie, do you feel lucky? Because I don't want to leave things to luck, right? The internet, for all of its shortcomings, and there are many, the internet is, like Ethereum, a public and permissionless network. It allows this very orderly world of enterprise commerce to exist alongside an entire spectrum of stuff, right? Some of it very, very good, and some of it maybe not very good, right? And what we know is that although 80 or 90% of the money, right, following the classic 80-20 rule, most of the money is in this nice, orderly, well-maintained enterprise garden. But most of the innovation, most of the transformation is outside of it, right? Disruptive innovators they don't come from inside the walled garden, right? Dual use technologies, they don't come from inside the walled garden. The dark web certainly doesn't. And over time, many of these things like Ethereum and Bitcoin are slowly making their way towards the kind of well-behaved enterprise walled garden. But they were allowed to exist on the internet because the internet is public and it's permissionless. They didn't have to get permission from somebody say, hey, I have this idea for a blockchain. It allows people to transact pseudonymously in a potential currency. No one said to them, let me form a committee and let's invite the lawyers to discuss and we'll let you know if you can join. But that's what it will be like in a permissioned ecosystem. And if I have one final thought for all of you, it's very simple and it's very clear. There is no such thing as permissioned innovation. Right? If you have to ask permission, the answer, if your product is sufficiently clever, sufficiently brilliant, and sufficiently disruptive, if you have to ask permission to offer it, the answer will always be no. So that's it for me. I'm looking forward. We have an amazing panel, and I'm going to hand it over to Dan to get us going on that. Oh, thank you, Dan. I love that.
That was awesome, Paul.
What is the sound of just one audience member clapping?
I'll get the rest of the audio track in to get the big clap. That was great, Paul. All right, so that was a fantastic introduction to the enterprise story and the enterprise community that bringing here to this panel. I'm Dan Shaw. I'm an advisor to the Ethereum Foundation on the enterprise ecosystem. Today, you met Paul, and we'll introduce a couple of the rest of our panelists here. Karen, do you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll hand it off to Joe.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone, and congratulations to the finalists today and for everything you've built and been working on. My name is Karen Scarbrough. I work for BP and our innovation group, and I'm excited to talk about an enterprise in Ethereum today.
Joe?
Hey everybody, I'm Joe McCann. I'm currently a strategist in the developer division of Cloud and AI at Microsoft. And prior to joining Microsoft, I joined about a year ago. I actually was actively involved with Dan Shaw in the Node.js community. And we co-founded a business together called NodeSource, which was the Node.js company. And so we have quite a bit of experience working with open source technologies and bringing them to enterprise and understanding that kind of positive feedback loop. So really excited to be able to share my experience and then also talk about how I think the Ethereum community could benefit from a lot of what Paul laid out in his keynote.
We'll insert the Paul Rudd gif of like, yeah, who would have expected you to be here?
Yes.
Fantastic. So, we have some high-profile community members here, and representing your organization, and a lot of what you get tasked with and asked to do is translating all of what's going on outside into your local community. So Karen, maybe you could kick us off. Like, where do you find folks getting hung up and with misconceptions that you are constantly having to redirect them toward?
Right. Well, with the first use cases that really stood out to enterprise were around tracking and tracing for blockchain and supply chain. And when you're explaining that to the audience in supply chain, and which I used to work in that arena with ERP systems, as Paul mentioned, when you say distributed database or distributed ledger, people think of putting their data on that, and they think of using blockchain as a vessel to actually share the data itself. And the past 3-4 years of proof of concepts and enterprise, there's been an aim to be able to use blockchain to do that instead of what it's fundamentally meant to do around verification of transactions, and being able to compose multiple applications one on top of another. So I think there's some re-education that needs to happen around where and when to appropriately use blockchain, and where to look at the innovation of it as well. I think we've hit a lot of upper peaks and what we've seen private blockchains able to accomplish. So looking more to where the real innovation is in the public space is where to look next, really.
Right on. Joe, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so from my perspective, I try to harness the view of the developer and map a lot of that to how the enterprise thinks about new technologies. And so I think one of the things is that, you know, there's been a significant amount of work done around the tooling and infrastructure required for developers to actually build applications, period. And I think there's still a lot to be done there. I know Microsoft has been actively involved across many teams across other divisions outside of the developer division that I work in. But within developer division, you know, we are responsible for things like Visual Studio, VS Code, GitHub, Azure services. And so looking at having kind of the primitives, if you will, fully baked, and then moving those towards kind of what are the best practices or standards. And I know Microsoft, working with Paul on Baseline Protocol, is helping shape a lot of that for specific enterprise applications. There's still that kind of hurdle mentally or sort of passionately to move traditional, say, Java or .NET developers to something like Solidity or to just the idea of smart contract programming. So I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done from the communications level. How do we message? How do we build an architecture around messaging with respect to building smart contract applications? And once developers get more comfortable with that and we start to see a bit more tangibly the power of these types of applications, I think you'll start to see a lot more flywheel effect of the tools and services that will start to stem from that to support the continued growth.
Nice. So, you know, meeting developers where they are, not expecting them to make that journey. That's awesome.
That's exactly right.
Paul?
The developer tools are the single most important thing. Unfortunately, we're still fairly immature in the world of tools for privacy. So Nightfall was an effort on our part to make things simpler. It's far from simple overall. And the toughest thing we've seen, and we spent a lot of time kind of building applications, it's hard for some people to wrap their heads around this idea of a properly decentralized application. They keep trying to write the same centralized application, but now it's in Solidity instead of Java, and that's not right. And I keep having these discussions like, think like a blockchain native, right? Inputs are tokens, outputs are tokens, right? You know, we're doing transactions. It's a hard mindset to shift. Enterprises are struggling with that, but I think they will get there, and they get it when you start to talk to them about the business process and the inputs and outputs of things like purchase orders and invoices.
Right on. So, yeah, that's done something interesting where, you know, open source becomes this, you know, sort of essential conduit for interactions. You know, open source is already hard for the enterprise. How does, you know, the addition of you know, working in you know, public blockchain especially, you know, change that landscape? Go ahead, Paul.
For us, it's actually quite the opposite. Open source is easier than closed source. So, and especially we made, I think, a particularly important decision, which was to go fully public domain. So one of the rules that affects companies that do auditing is you should not evaluate your own work, because predictably that leads to, I did that and I think it was brilliant problem, right? So imagine that if we kept control of all of this code and other companies used it and some of those companies were audited by us, we would be in a situation where we might be called upon to evaluate that code. By going full public domain, relinquishing ownership, there's a bunch of advantages. Number one, it's not ours, right? And other people have taken it, they've edited, they've changed it. So it's not just that it's not ours anymore, but it's changed from what we originally did, right? Secondly, there's no financial incentive for us, right? There's no complications. And then thirdly, for enterprises, right, one of the problems with open source, which is also a problem for any form of software, is the license agreement, right? You know, that thing you click on OK to, right? That thing is 60,000 words, right? Ours is like 6 words, which is do what you want with this. It's not ours anymore. And that actually removes friction. So, you know, in this case, I think open source, and especially the public domain flavor of open source, was powerful for us.
Nice. Yeah, Joe, I know we had to deal with a lot of folks with W2FPL and you know, helping folks do that. Anything that you want to add, or Karen?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just chime in quickly before Karen. You know, one of the things that we learned with kind of growing the global Node.js community is, on the one hand, we had kind of like this really early in the beginning, these kind of almost anarchic style open source zealots and developers, right? That were just, you know, writing tons of code and releasing tons of modules, and they were putting there is an open source license called WTFPL that is as plain as day. You can do whatever you want with this, except enterprise legal departments don't approve that license. And so what we recognized was that even something as simple as, no, I seriously don't care, you can do whatever you want with it, restricts the ability for enterprise developers or developers that work within an enterprise to contribute to a project. And so I think there are some things that can be done, and I clearly don't know the spectrum of this within the broader ETH community because there's so many different projects available, but there are little things like that add up to friction. And I think to Paul's point, removing that friction can help accelerate a lot of the innovation. I think the second piece is that, you know, 20 years ago, open source was not welcomed by most large companies, let alone certainly tech companies. And we've seen a complete about face with that. In fact, even at Microsoft, we are incredibly passionate and welcoming to the open source community, and open source lots and lots of code. We do a lot of products in the open. This is just a complete sea change event that happened with software development. I think the next iteration of this is recognizing the value of a public chain and moving a lot of this stuff to public chain and seeing what is the value that we can actually all start to build, still, you know, retaining. It's just the same thing with a lot of companies today. They open source a lot of stuff, they provide stuff in the open, but they still have their secret sauce, or they still have something that actually, you know, they can derive value from to serve their shareholders or their business. I think the same thing is ultimately going to be happening with respect to public blockchain, is they can treat it almost like how they've thought about open source initially 20 years ago, and recognizing now open source is actually the biggest value driver for software development today.
Ron?
For me, it makes me think of a conversation I recently had in the organization. We were talking about open sourcing and blockchain and public blockchain and why that would be valuable. And I pointed to a particular project in the DeFi space, and one of our leaders looked at it and said, well, there's only just a few pull requests on this. I don't see how open sourcing it contributes to contributions. And we actually had a conversation around, I showed him the activity and the total value locked in this project, how other projects had built on top of it. So it's, and when he looked at it again, he said, okay, so it's more of the open API. And I know Solidity people will correct me and say it's an ABI, but I mean, that's that transition in language and understanding that really was a light bulb moment for the both of us, and understanding the value that we were trying to communicate, and really where open source is different now, potentially in public blockchains, than it was in the past.
We're done. So, you know, as we're looking forward, you know, we have, you know, all the consortium chains and, you know, a lot of the effort that we've put into that. But, you know, I keep hearing everyone, you know, really looking, you know, toward mainnet and toward our collaboration there. You know, one of the key components that, you know, I see in terms of aligning enterprise expectation is, simplifying, their cognitive load with things like baseline protocol. Paul, maybe you could, kick off the discussion around baseline. And I know that it's a big contribution from y'all, but now, getting folks from, this exists to, we're going to go out into the sun and operate there. How's that going, and how can we, sort of help folks on that journey?
So it's going pretty well overall. We've gotten a pretty good reception. We've tried very hard to switch the conversation with our clients from this is blockchain and let us talk about what blockchain can do for you to this is off-chain network procurement. It's a procurement system. It guarantees that you get your negotiated volume discounts. When we switch that conversation, blockchain tends to sort of be further back in this, and it's much more about the value that can be created, right? Eventually we get to, it's built on the baseline protocol. We use zero knowledge proofs in order to protect your privacy. So my message, relentless message inside of EY and to our teams is, let's talk about the product. Let's talk about what the product does. And then if the technical people want to get into baseline, we're happy to do that. So that's the conversation we're trying to shift towards when we talk to external clients and decision makers. Right. So now Karen is a good example of somebody who, is quite savvy about the underlying technology, right? And Karen, you probably talk to a ton of your own business users inside of BP every day.
And I was in supply chain prior to jumping into blockchain. So understanding, having used an ERP system, like I can say from my experience as a buyer, and as a customer service rep way early in my career, I would have loved just one portal and base system to where all my customers connected, or because what happened, although things would be digitally automated, if I had to log into one customer portal for customer A, another one for customer B and C, then it really didn't achieve the value that was people originally perceived it doing, because you were actually increasing the workload. So if you're able to connect all that in a better way, it's a much better environment to work in.
Joe, anything else you want to add to that, or we'll move into my sort of ender question? Cool. All right.
I want to say one thing about Microsoft. So the toughest thing that we had, and this was I want to tell this story because it's both a good story and thoroughly humiliating. And there's nothing I like more than humiliating myself. So early on in my time at EY, we had this amazing procurement contract from a really big company, and we built a whole procurement system for them. And we were in the final review meeting, and the client's like, this is amazing, it's fantastic, it's going to save us hundreds of millions of dollars, and we're not going to implement. And I was like, what? Right? I was like, I was writing the press release in my head, and my brain caught up with it, and we're not going to implement part. And the answer was, blockchain news scary, right? Change is good. You call us when somebody else has done this first. And that is, so many of our sales cycles ended in that discussion. And if there's one thing that I'm really grateful to from Microsoft, the Xbox royalty system that we are doing together, we found a client who was courageous enough to go first. And that is something that is as rare and valuable as possible to get, because once they do it, the world follows. But you just got to get that client. And no matter how many times you tell somebody we're using it, they don't see that as nearly as valuable as having an actual external client that's using this solution and can report business value. Then that helps to unlock the floodgates. And it's one in every industry. And in the case of Microsoft, we could not ask for a better partner and client because of their courage to go forward and to be first.
Well, on behalf of all of Microsoft, I will thank you, Paul.
Yeah, and we saw this in spades. There was a point where D. Shaw is going to talk about Netflix and Netflix, PayPal, Walmart. That was just a stick in Node.js. So, looking into the future, let's go into the next big push. Joe, you want to kick us off? Where are things going?
Yeah, so just to give folks a little bit more about my background, I've been in technology for 20 years plus, but I've also worked on Wall Street. And actually, just before I joined Microsoft, I ran a quant trading desk at an institutional hedge fund in San Francisco, but for cryptocurrencies. And so what was really fascinating about that is you can imagine how disjointed and kind of broken these markets are. There's incredible opportunities. But from a developer or a technologist perspective, I was really fascinated what was happening with DeFi. And I saw a number of the hackathon submissions that are mind-blowingly, incredibly brilliant and amazing. But for me, there's something very unique about the concept of DeFi in general. And it's because for the first time, I believe, we now have the ability to have money or value that is programmatically accessible. And that unleashes innovation at a level in finance that I think has never been seen before. And so as I try to, as best I can, keep up with the DeFi community, I take a step back and look more broadly at kind of the Ethereum community of developers and say, there's kind of like two types of developers, and I'm clearly generalizing, so don't beat me up, internet, please. But we recognize this in other open source projects. You have some folks that are really good at scalability and performance and just getting in and fiddling bits, right? I almost call them like the mad scientist kind of academic type programmers that just want to work on the core open source project or set of projects. And then you have these, what I call product engineers, where they see these primitives, these Legos, if you will, and they're like, oh, I see all the Legos, let me build a thing with it. And for me, that is best personified in what's happening with DeFi. So what's really exciting from a developer's perspective, and I think where we're going to see a lot more kind of innovative growth in the Ethereum community is the explosive amount of innovation in DeFi. And I'll give one example. I know this canonical example has been used probably 100 times today, but there's a concept of flash loans or collateral-less loans. This concept of being able to have a parallel set of instructions to, arbitrage something or enable lending without someone actually having collateral is next to impossible in the traditional financial world. Yet, when you take technologists that have this new platform and set of primitives that are available to them, we've come up with this as a community, or someone came up with this concept, right? And now it's kind of caught wildfire. We saw over the summer this concept of yield farming. And I won't go into whether it was bad or good. It's just the idea that we continue to see more and more innovation around the Ethereum community via the DeFi vehicle. And so that, to me, is one of the most exciting things, is we have an opportunity here to kind of rewrite how we think about value exchange and literally write it programmatically, which is one of the areas that myself and my team are really keeping a pulse on, is to kind of monitor that group to see how can we best support them to continue innovating in the space.
Nice. Karen, what's your next big push?
Well, it's been a really big year for BP in multiple ways. So in February, we announced that we're aiming to be carbon neutral by 2050. Well, I should say we will be carbon neutral by 2050. And that's really exciting for us. So even absent of COVID and the major economic changes, we were going to change in a big way this year. And what's happened around the world has only accelerated that with where oil and gas is right now. So we are changing tremendously as a company internally, as opposed to where our focuses are, where our new business models are going. So right now we're in a major push of validating demand for our new initiatives and projects, and adapting to innovating behind having discovered that demand. So the biggest pushes for us is to stay innovative while validating demand. And obviously we're here because public blockchains are in consideration of that, but there's so many other technologies that are contributing to that. But we're really transitioning just much of what we're focusing on in climate action to better serve and better prepare for a more sustainable world ahead.
Awesome, that's exciting. Paul, next big push.
So maybe sort of one big push and one prediction. So the big push for us is really the industrialization of public blockchain. So over the last 6 months and over the next 6 months, we're finishing this process of moving all of our EY blockchain products from being kind of behind the firewall implementations to SaaS applications that run at blockchain.ey.com. So we're taking away all the complexity. So if you're not a low-level developer, you can go to blockchain.ey.com, you can set up procurement, you can do blockchain, you can do Block Explorer, you can do smart contract testing, things like that. So we're migrating all of our product into this environment, and we are maturing it to the point where we think we want to be able to run almost any enterprise business process. So my hypothesis is fundamentally the way the companies interact is it's all variations of I have money, you've got stuff, products or services, and we are exchanging them under the rules of some kind of an agreement. Well, the money and the stuff can be accurately represented as tokens of some kind, and the exchange is represented as a smart contract. So if I get really good at representing tokens and I get really good at implementing smart contracts, I have everything I need to model and implement any kind of business process. So that's kind of my number one push, is to get to the point where you bring me any process, insurance, car sales, manufacturing output, freight logistics, I can model that, implement it, and run it for you as a network level solution. That's job one. Job two, so that's my big push. Strategic goal or prediction that I would make is I believe that by 2030, more than 50% of all new business contracts will be done on the public Ethereum mainnet. Now, how do I get to that number? Do I just magically make it up? No, I nearly magically make it up based on what happened with cloud. So in 2006, Amazon brought us AWS and especially the kind of elastic storage, right? There's a storage environment, right? At that time, if you had gone to a corporate CIO and said, hey, you're going to use the public cloud, they'd been like, the what? Right? Or maybe if they knew what it was, they'd be like, not ready, not mature. In 2017, 11 years later, more than 50% of all new ERP implementations, all new enterprise application implementations were done on the public cloud. So we went from what's that to, of course, I'm doing it on the public cloud in about a decade. I think that sort of in 2020, with the maturing of privacy-based technology and the shift towards public blockchain, this is the starting gun for enterprise usability. And so a decade, in the course of a decade, we're going to go from, that sounds interesting, but I don't think I can do this, to, of course, we want to execute this contract on the Ethereum mainnet. So that's my prediction. Enterprises take time. A decade is not an unreasonable transition time.
Right on. That's a great way to end. All right. So that does it for our panel. I want to make sure that we open things up to some questions. I'm getting some questions from chat from folks. All right. How will enterprise adoption look different in different countries with different kinds of economies? Will there be a leapfrog dynamic, what we see with IT rollout in developing countries? Anyone want to jump on that?
I can take a stab at it, but I'll preface this with it's probably wrong. It's just a theory. So what this makes me think of is this question, the way it's framed of, how will enterprise adoption look different in different countries and different kind of economies, reminds me of the explosion of mobile payments in Africa. So, for decades, the majority of folks in Africa were underbanked. They just simply did not have a bank nearby, or were unable to get a bank account. But instead, they all had mobile phones. And so the mobile phone actually enabled them to, more or less have a bank account. They used this thing called M-Pesa, which was I believe it was a combination of a number of companies that came together to enable
mostly,
payments.
Kenya Mobile.
There you go. Yeah. And so for them, they had this kind of, leapfrog moment of, we went from being completely underbanked to being one of the leaders in digital banking and mobile banking, right? In terms of the experience for their consumers and users. And so I don't know what that analogy looks like today with, say, enterprise adoption of, smart contract programming or blockchain-based applications. But it makes me think that would be a clue for what that would actually look like. Is what are some areas where somebody doesn't have the ability to, I don't know, have access to certain systems, or there's so much fragmentation, or there's something disjoint with the experience today that they just can't download something from GitHub and get it up and running, that enables them to actually jump forward, similar to what happened with folks in Africa with M-Pesa.
Nice. Paul, Karen, anything else? I got another question coming in.
Let's go to the next question.
All right. This is an interesting one. So why do you all think that privacy hasn't been much of the focus of enterprise blockchain work?
So I want to dive on that one.
Yeah, do
it. Privacy has been the focus of enterprise blockchain work, but the way that it's been focused on has been different. So privacy on a public network is really hard. I mean, we have 6 nuclear physicists, mathematician PhDs working on this, and have been working on this for 3 or 4 years. And nobody remembers this, but when we debuted our prototype at DevCon of Nightfall, the gas consumption to complete a single ZKP transaction cost over $100. Right? This was not a viable solution. And it was incredibly difficult. It was obscure. It was expensive. Not many people thought it was possible. But there was an easier way of doing privacy. It was called put a private blockchain together. And so that's what everybody did. And private blockchains have their own immense problems, which is why they've largely fallen flat, because signing up for some kind of proprietary private network that's really expensive is a deal killer. And I'll be honest with you, I spent years inside of EY dealing with the intense skeptics who thought we were wasting money on all this ZKP stuff. They're like, you got to get with the program and start selling more private blockchain stuff. And it's the fact is that technically private blockchains are much easier, but it's a dangerous short-term answer because nobody really wants to be on your proprietary private network. So privacy is the be-all and end-all of enterprise blockchains. It's just that the way that they chose to do it wasn't really scalable in the long run.
I think Paul said it really well, and I think what I'd have to add is that the standing up of so much private blockchains over the past 2-3 years within enterprise, if anything, it's a benefit because we've learned the shortcomings there. So like you said, we have focused on privacy. It's just looked different behind private walls, but we've seen the challenges and getting people on the same consortium, on actually building multiple systems on top of a blockchain versus having separate blockchains for all these different proof of concepts. So it's definitely helped us learn what we really need out of a blockchain system.
So I've got a quick jab here, Paul. Thanks for all the fish, but where's the identity solution for the enterprise that is open public domain?
So I think that's one of the areas where I'm hoping that others will step in. Right? We've thought really hard about what is the thing that we can contribute that's the most used, and we decided to zero in on privacy. It's interesting that there isn't yet a good enterprise privacy identity solution because. About 18 months ago, I thought, wow, there's so many of these consumer identity programs going on, right? We should not do something there because it'll become too crowded for enterprises. And maybe I was wrong, although I do know Microsoft is working quite a bit on enterprise identity. So I think our impact can be bigger when we choose to do a small number of things really well And I'm hoping that others will choose to pick identity and make that their success case. I think Joe's nodding, so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't work on that team. I am familiar with, certainly Microsoft has probably the largest identity system today for enterprise, with Active Directory and other forms of traditional IT identity. I do know that there is a team that's also working on a decentralized version of identity, which I know basically nothing about except that team exists. Welcome to Microsoft, a massive company. But it's exciting to actually hear that, or it's reassuring to hear that, I do agree with you, Paul, that there are certain aspects of, it's like, these are things that we want to focus on. These are things that we want to be really good at. And, Microsoft has decades of software development and technology resources available to them that enable them to actually put effort across myriad opportunities with respect to technology innovations, something like decentralized identity being one of them.
Great. I got one last question here, and this is actually, near and dear to my heart. In bringing together folks from the enterprise perspective and inviting folks to join, there's one area that I didn't quite get onto this stage, and the question is, how do we get governments and public industry involved in blockchain? And that was actually one of my stretch goals for these sessions, to get some of the folks that I met at ETH Denver and the governor's office there, begin connecting the dots with those folks. So it's happening at a certain level, but the enterprise tends to be reticent and private, and cordoned off at its first attempt. In public industry and government, is even worse. I started my career off in defense, and the technologies that we were using that was approved, was 10 to 15 years old, just because that had been what had vetted. So there's innovation happening. I don't know if anyone has any other comments that they want to add specifically to that, but
sure.
It's beginning to percolate.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that the timing, certainly, and I'm going to speak from a U.S. centric point of view, because I'm familiar with my country's political and economic standing right now. I actually think if you look at what has happened over the past decade with the decriminalization and legalization of marijuana, it was not because people realized that pot isn't that dangerous of a drug or whatever. It's that there was money involved. And a lot of these states were having budget shortfalls and deficits that they saw an opportunity to actually generate additional revenue from taxing marijuana. And hey, why not? Let's decriminalize it. This could also potentially free up resources from the criminal justice system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if we map that to something like blockchain, look at Paul's case study with Microsoft and Xbox. I mean, we're talking about a 99% reduction in the amount of time that it took to pay out these royalties, the 40% just overhead administrative cost. So I think, especially given given the COVID environment and how a lot of state and local businesses, governments are struggling to kind of maintain their balance sheets, this presents an opportunity, I would say, for developers, savvy product people to approach folks at the local level and say, hey, have you thought about adapting this type of technology solution that could save you X amount of dollars? And I think that is the type of thing that could be the kind of Trojan horse, if you will, for lack of a better phrase, to get the idea of utilizing a public chain and understanding how blockchain-based applications can be levered inside of the government. That's
great. That's a great product development story. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap it up with that. Paul, Karen, and Joe, thank you so much. This was fantastic discussion. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you all for giving us your time today and for an amazing conversation. So with that, we are ready to move on to our next talk. And I'm super excited to welcome Abby, who's going to be talking about Radical. And for those of you who don't know, she works at Radical, and she will be covering a history of kind of how code collaboration has evolved and what a decentralized version of that feature would look like.